It's time for a rare, deliberate sequel. A while ago I did a video on moral panics and I had a great deal of fun talking about how Slipknot and Mortal Kombat drove people insane and about the time Dee Snider owned Tipper Gore and managed to make everyone look really stupid. It was great. I highly recommend the video to you, but it felt a bit incomplete. And there's a couple of reasons why. One reason is I didn't really get into an interesting aspect of moral panics, and that is the figure of the folk devil. What role they play in this dynamic, how they're made alongside the panic, and what the consequences are of making someone or something or some group into a folk devil. The other reason is, while I spoke a lot about some interesting case studies, I didn't really talk about the one that inspired me into throwing the topic into the poll that I run for Patreon subscribers to pick the video. And I am going to talk about that today, kind of, in a very particular way. If you're curious about how I'm going to tackle it, don't worry, all will be revealed shortly. We'll be beginning at the basics, trying to establish what the figure of the folk devil is, while reminding ourselves about what a moral panic actually is, and we'll get into our case study for today, followed by some of the consequences of this happening in this specific case, and what that means for you if you're going to be made into a folk devil, or a part of a group already being panicked about. What is a folk devil? Let's take a step back and summarize that old video I mentioned in the intro. If you want to watch the whole thing, you can, but I've tried to write this so that, like language modules at university or traffic lights, it's optional. The important things to remember about moral panics for the purposes of this video are: 1. They're a response to something that sits outside of social norms or expectations. 2. The response is based on false or exaggerated perceptions caused by information, usually provided by the press, that exaggerates the threat to society that this group or act presents. And 3. This results in a widespread fear, which is based on these false or exaggerated perceptions. So when we're talking about a folk devil, we need to acknowledge first that the moral panic that surrounds this figure is false or exaggerated, and that people are already in a state of fear about them by the time they can figure out that they've been made into a folk devil. Folk deviled? Okay, that makes them sound like an egg dish, so I'm gonna leave that alone. The other important thing I want us to recall about moral panics is what happens if they take hold. If enough people get themselves riled up about, say, a pixelated spine being ripped out of a character in Mortal Kombat in 1990, God knows what year exactly it was, but you get the idea, then the government will step in and introduce age ratings for video games. Now, you might look at that and say, that seems more or less fine, but that's probably the most benign example I could have presented to you. The point is that a critical mass of people panicking means that government or state intervention is likely, and it's not always as clean as something like age ratings. Just ask the people on the receiving end of the second Red Scare. The final important thing about moral panics I want to draw our attention to before I jump into the specific figure of the folk devil is that they rely on the thing being panicked about or figures engaging in them being somehow outside of social norms, or as the literature puts it, deviant or engaging in deviance, and that's not a term I enjoy throwing around, so like I did in the last video, I'm going to be kind of talking around the word where possible, but if you want to know the specific term, you know it now, so that's that. Also, it's important to note that the groups that sit outside of social norms tend to lack power or the ability to exercise power effectively. Let's think of some example of folk devils and see what they can tell us about the role of the folk devil and what exactly they're for. In the UK, we ebb and flow out of a moral panic around issues of immigration and asylum seekers, particularly with the BBC's racism correspondent? No, that's not his official job title, but it may as well be. Simon Jones, whose job it is to, hold on, let me make sure I've got this right, stand on the cliffs of Dover and openly seethe about people trying to reach the UK. Is that right? I feel like that can't actually be someone's job. I've just checked, and yeah, that's his job. Constantly reporting on the minutiae of Britain's asylum policy and constantly alerting to the fact that people are coming to the UK to seek asylum, which I'm sure doesn't do anything at all to people's perceptions. Also, God, imagine coming here, like how desperate you'd have to be, for goodness sake. When the press wants to ramp up anti-immigrant or anti-asylum seeker sentiment, they fire up the machine, and people like Simon Jones help keep up a stream of material for them to reach for when they need something to pitch their lead-poisoned boomer readers. The most recent people to get moral panicked about are Albanian people, and when I was growing up I knew precisely 2 Albanian people. One was a classmate of mine and the other was my barber, and yes, before anyone gets into it, yes, I have been to a barber before. They both seem fine, so I was slightly confused by this. That confusion happened for a reason. One, because the moral panic isn't for me. I'm under 50, from an ethnic minority, and I'm neither physically nor politically bald. And the sudden fixation with Albania and Albanians does neatly illustrate one important part of the designation of the folk devil, which is that moral panics cause folk devils. Like, it's a direct line, right? I was informed in the proofreading, by the way, that you might want a quick crash course on what political baldness is, because my partner proofreads it and was like, I think you need to explain this, so I'm going to explain it very quickly. Political baldness is to have the stereotypical politics of a red-faced, bald British person, usually from the home counties, but not always, and you can hold these opinions independent of whether or not you have hair. So you can be bald, but not bald. It's really simple. I'm going to throw up a political compass that explains it to you somewhere around here. Let's get back to it. Let's stick to our example of Albanian people for a second. If a newspaper or journalist or, I don't know, a famous media personality just came out and said, Albanian people being in the UK is bad, or asylum seekers are scum, or that either of these groups are damaging the social fabric in some imperceivable yet terrible way, you would probably look at that, and I would hope you would look at that, and I would hope most people would look at that in the abstract and say, that person is a dickhead. Because believing those things makes you a dickhead. So there needs to be a context where you can say it, but without saying it. And that's what the moral panic provides. You're not mad at Albanian people, you're mad at a lack of school places, like in this tweet.
Kent's council leaders say secondary schools in Canterbury and Ashford currently have no Year 7 and Year 9 places for local children due to the unexpected and therefore unplanned for arrivals of refugee children disproportionately placed by the Home Office in these 2 areas.
See, you're not racist or dislike asylum seekers, you just really don't want there to be pressure put disproportionately on school systems. Then you combine that with an out of context statistic, like around half of asylum seekers are from Albania, and then you have the cover to say, see, I knew it was the Albanians, even when it was austerity, I knew it was them. Then you combine that with a video of Albanian people in London celebrating their Independence Day with a caption saying something like, not an invasion, kind of like this tweet here. And then you're really setting off the fire of a moral panic and making yourself a juicy folk devil steak on it. Sorry, I was probably quite hungry when I wrote this script, and also watching certain food war criminal videos. Anyway, I watched the video in the tweet, by the way. It's just kind of normal. People do this all the time for football matches. And not even just like minority communities, like people do it all the fucking time. I know for a fact that Turkish people did this in the UK in 2008 after the Turkish national team beat Croatia on penalties. Yes, I had to get that in because I'm not sure when the World Cup final is in relation to this coming out, but it will have happened. I do want to remember the good times sometimes. Let's take a very 1990s moral panic. I don't know why I'm wagging my finger at you like I'm your mum. If I said to you, single mothers are a threat to society, just out of the blue, kind of like what I just did, with no context, you, again, would probably look at me like I'm a dickhead. Because, again, if you believe that, you're a dickhead. But in the 80s and 90s, there was a concerted effort by both governing parties in the UK over that time to cut benefits, because benefits would create what some people call dependency culture. But really, it was a means to create a disciplined and desperate well of reserve labour with no regard for whether those people could be in work in the first place. The culmination of the moral panic could be seen in John Major's socially conservative Back to Basics campaign, which was the 90s peak of slogans adopted moments before disaster, because it turned out basically every member of the government was banging someone who wasn't their spouse or partner, which, to be clear, I don't care about. But when you make other people's living arrangements your problem, then you really got to make sure you have the not banging people who aren't your wife issue squared away. Just as a general piece of advice if you're planning to do that. Single mothers were one of the prominent targets of this, their existence leading to a generation of children who would become criminals because their feckless, welfare-dependent mothers were incapable of instilling the good values that we all know intrinsically because, you know, we were all raised in a totally functional, traditional nuclear family. I would say, raise your hands if that wasn't true for you, but I feel like that's a recipe for making me and a lot of other people kind of sad, so I'm just going to move on with it. All of this served to make single mothers and their children, which fits into a pattern in the UK around young people, into folk devils, who were there to justify declining state support generally, because might we all end up like the hated single mother leeching off the welfare state if there was a welfare state to leech off? Now, to be clear, we wouldn't, because single mothers aren't like this and they aren't a threat to society. Which I feel like I shouldn't have to clarify, but I felt like it was important to do it right there. Through all this, I wanted to think about being an Albanian person or an asylum seeker generally in the UK right now, or being a single mother in the 80s or 90s, or even now if we're being honest to an extent. Would you, who are most likely not these things, want to be part of those groups? The honest answer is probably not. And part of that's because no one wants to be in the centre of media hysteria or attention. But that's only part of why you shouldn't want to be the folk devil. Because the folk devil serves as an example of something we're not meant to be. And we should resist the things that would make us into them or like them. For example, if you don't want your child to become a delinquent, you better stay in your marriage that's collapsing so that you don't become a single parent. Or, to use a moral panic that's coming back a little because people are losing their minds, you better stop them listening to heavy metal, otherwise they'll end up on YouTube. By the way, don't forget to like and subscribe. It would be wrong for me to end this section without explaining some of the consequences in the examples I've mentioned. In the case of single mothers, one of the things that I always remember, and it relates to a special video perhaps coming soon, and my old video on lesser evilism, which will appear somewhere by the magic of YouTube, is that one of the new Labour government's first acts was to cut benefits for them, because the political atmosphere of the moral panic necessitated state action against the folk devil. In the case of asylum seekers, it resulted in Britain trying to outsource its responsibilities to Rwanda, and just forcing them to go there or back to their country of origin, which is fucked up. There's nothing more to add. As well as this, it resulted in a series of Home Secretaries, for those of you not in the UK, that's the head of the racism department, to harden our already insanely hard border regime, which, by the way, is literally called the hostile environment, and I also talk about that in the Lesser Evil video briefly, and you'll never guess who sowed the seeds of it. I think you can pretty much guess who sowed the seeds for it. The result of this was endangering more people instead of simply allowing people to safely come to the UK. I mean, if they're trying to come here, that should tell you how desperate they are. So we have our idea of the folk devil as something caused by a moral panic and held up to society through the moral panic framework as something we should not aspire to be like. And I have a specific case study in mind. It's maybe a little personal, but I'm going to try to explain it in a way that means I don't get really mad about it. Maybe. Okay, me from the future editing this, let's just put the section title in and get on with it before I say something really, really insane. Making a folk devil. Okay, we have our idea of what a folk devil is, and I try to write a version of the script. a long time ago, in the pre-1K subscriber age of my channel, where I tried to talk about it in a general term with a variety of examples. The problem was that I didn't feel like I was doing something that I could perform well to the camera, because ultimately that's something I need to be able to do to make the videos land. And before anyone gets cute in the comments and goes, "When have you ever performed well to the camera?" It was the main character video. That was the one time I ever did it. There, asked and answered. But I felt like I was being so broad that I couldn't make the point about the actual process, because jumping from example to example kind of broke it up. The other issue is that I wanted to pick something where other people hadn't really spoken about it in those terms before, or where I wasn't going to be straying too far out of my lane, because to be quite frank, we don't need to hear from me on certain topics. The trouble I had with the example I'm going with is, how do I tell you about them without immediately prejudicing you in one direction or another? If you're in the UK, you will almost certainly have heard of and have an opinion about the folk devil example I'm going to present to you today. I'm not even joking. This is the kind of person we have opinion polling about, and they have almost 100% name recognition in the UK, which seems like I'm exaggerating, but I'm really not. So if I present them to you straight away, you'll most likely have an opinion about them, or people associated with them, and that will shift your opinion on whether I'm talking total shite or whether I've actually connected the dots well here. So what we're going to do is we're going to refer to them, but without referring to them or trying to identify them. We're just going to look through the facts of the coverage about them. That poses other problems, since there will be references to events you might remember, so I'm going to censor as much information and sort of identifying bits of images as I can without, like, leaving you with basically nothing, like it's been redacted by the CIA or something. So, fair warning, when we have quotes read out, there will be a lot of censor bleeps. It's not me covering up swearing or anything like that. It's just to make the conceit of the video work. It should go without saying, before we dive into this, that the point of this section of the video isn't to present a specific rebuttal to any of the things said about our folk devil example. The fact that I'm assigning them that role should tell you what I think of the coverage, public reaction, and yes, even a little state reaction to them. The point of the exercise isn't to dispute whether this coverage happened. It did. I'll provide a document in the description linking to original copies of everything I show you here. And the point isn't to debate whether the coverage was proportionate or deserved, or the result of a lack of action on the part of the folk devil, because it wasn't proportionate or deserved. That's why I can use this term to describe them. While those of you who might have guessed already or guessed later might argue that our folk devil, or at least the central figure of it, had relative power, I don't believe they could have exercised it in a way that, say, the police have been able to, where they're able to deflect or downplay their role in terrible acts. But the police really did commit the terrible acts, unlike our folk devil, who either didn't do anything terrible or didn't do the thing that they were accused of. I can't really get more specific than that without ruining the whole anonymous folk devil, you know, who's that folk devil sort of thing that I have going on, because I really wanted to use that Pokemon background to make a thumbnail. So let's just get on with it. Let's stop this whole thing. Let's just go. As an explanation of why I'm interested in this particular example, I want to share a couple of graphs with you. I know, very STEM brain of me, but it goes some way to explain why I find it so interesting that barely anyone has thought about it, or at least explicitly put together a big thing about it like I have. To my knowledge, someone might have. I'm not denying that. I have an advantage here in that I know what these graphs represent. Luckily for us, our folk devil had enough profile that there was routine opinion polling about them and public opinion about our folk devil, and I suppose the surrounding lesser demons, if we want to keep the devil analogy going, impacted our second graph, which will show up about now. If you're not from the UK or just aren't as much of a nerd as me, you won't have any idea if what I'm showing you is normal or strange. Let me tell you, this kind of graph, for the kind of data we're talking about, is basically unprecedented. Part of it being unprecedented is because I believe that the moral panic that created our folk devil ebbed here, and then unleashed fully after that ebb, almost allowed the folk devil to hold a position that could have led to the perpetrators of the moral panic facing some kind of consequence. Though, I don't think that would have happened. But aside from some obvious cynics, I believe that fear was at least partially genuine. One of the earliest things I remember was the use of the word saintly in association with the folk devil, and that this was allowed to be broadcast and written and repeated on the BBC, as well as written in their articles. A quote in 2015 about our folk devil was allowed to be repeated pretty much over and over again. We'll go to it now.
He is a saintly figure of enormous personal integrity. He is a man who lives his life according to his beliefs. Former MP speaking to Panorama.
And this word crops up again in another BBC article, this time as an interpretation of the light an anecdote about our folk devil puts them in.
She told a story about that cast him in a saintly light. He had donated his shoes to raise funds for the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and cycled home in his socks.
You might think it's very odd for a person who you're claiming was the victim of a moral panic to have this kind of coverage exist about them. And you'd be right, it is unusual. In fact, the article the second quote is from contains a reasonably dispassionate list of the folk devil's chosen causes, though they've picked ones that hint about future coverage of them. What's interesting in these is the use of the word saintly, and this other, I believe carefully chosen word, worshipper, used in this quote from that same article.
Crowds of and worshippers were turned away from an overflowing anti-austerity rally at the Quaker Meeting House in Brighton on Monday night.
This is when we begin to see a characterization of our folk devil and the people who supported them. A common accusation was that these people were in a cult, not unlike the moral panics of old, where devil worshippers were coming to destroy the society you held so dear. No, don't think about your material condition in that society. And there was no such hysteria yet at the time of these articles. Yet, right? But you begin to see the seeds of it sown here. Part of the reason why it didn't reach the fever pitch it would eventually get to is because this still had an element of novelty to our press. And while this novelty did exist, and it did impact some aspects of the coverage, we were given not too subtle hints at a key part of the moral panic to come: potential state overreaction. It didn't come to this specific example of state overreaction and reaction, but the mere fact that this article is a thing and that it exists and was reported on widely suggests that something abnormal was happening, and the press indulging this person were, if not necessarily approving explicitly, were trying to make people think of our folk devil as a particular type of threat. Pay attention to the use of a certain word here. I find it interesting in the characterization of our folk devil as something to avoid being like, if you're a particular type of person.
A senior serving general has reportedly warned that a government could face a mutiny from the army if it tried to downgrade them. The unnamed general said members of the armed forces would begin directly and publicly challenging the leader if he tried to scrap Trident, pull out of NATO, or announce any plans to emasculate and shrink the size of the armed forces. He told the Sunday Times, "The army just wouldn't stand for it. The general staff would not allow a prime minister to jeopardize the security of this country, and I think people would use whatever means possible, fair or foul, to prevent that. You can't put a maverick in charge of the country's security."
Look, this is actually quite serious and actually almost unprecedented. Certainly post-Cold War, it's unprecedented to even see this in the press in the UK, because usually, and I just want to make this clear, the UK military don't usually brief that they're going to coup someone. That being said, I do find it very funny that this anonymous general associated a reduced military budget not being a member of an American-led military alliance that generally ruins the countries that it shows up in, and no longer having weapons that can turn hundreds of thousands of people into radioactive vapor with, comparing it with emasculation. I find that kind of funny, definitely. And this was 8 days into our folk devil's assumption of an official position within UK politics. You can imagine that a lot of the places we're going to be going to will be lacking hinges. With that in mind, let me ask the British among you a question. Do you know the words to the national anthem? Or do you think singing it is a big part of our culture? I know we had a recent change to the national anthem on account of Lizzie being in the mud, but the rest of the words are more or less the same. Probably don't think it is if you're watching one of my videos and probably don't even give a shit about the words. And to be honest with you, I don't give a fuck about the national anthem either. Sadly for our folk devil, it was decided that the national anthem was the most important thing in the country, which I find very, very weird and difficult to understand, because this country, at least in comparison to, say, like America or Turkey, the national anthem is not that big of a deal. But look at some of the unhinged reaction to them choosing to stand in respectful silence at a quite sombre event.
Downing Street said the Prime Minister attached importance to the national anthem and was very proud to sing it. A spokeswoman said the importance that the PM attaches to the national anthem is visible every time he is at one of these commemorative services. He is very proud and willing to join with others singing the national anthem. Conservative MP Andrew Rosendale, who has campaigned to promote patriotism, said it was disappointing that had chosen not to sing the anthem and offered to teach him the words. Should understand that the British people are overwhelmingly supportive of our monarchy and our constitution, he said. The MP for Romford added was free not to do it in private but should on a state occasion. It is his duty and the duty of any leader of any party that seeks to be Prime Minister to accept that we are the nation that we are, he said. Tory MP Sir Nicholas Soames, the grandson of Winston Churchill, said not singing the anthem was very rude and very disrespectful to the Queen and the Battle of Britain pilots who gave their all. It was an extremely disrespectful thing, and I think he needs to make his mind up whether he is a grown-up or not, added Soames. Nigel Farage, the UKIP leader, said, I was at St Paul's and noticed when not uttering a word of the national anthem, but then he is a hardcore Republican to his fingertips, something that very few voters would support.
Oh my god, they wheeled out Winston Churchill's grandson to cry about our folk devil choosing not to sing the national anthem, and treated the demented frogman Nigel Farage as if he has anything valid to say about anything at all. In the article you also note that they ascribe to our folk devil the trait of pacifist, which I can assure you they mean it as a slur when, as much as it might have its flaws as an ideology, it's not coming from a bad place, I don't think. I also note that my partner who proofread this called Andrew Rosendale an idiot in her notes on the script, which, if people are wondering what I think of that, I kind of agree. He does seem like a bit of an idiot. Also, I think it's very important to note the part about accept the country that we are, almost as if our folk devil is a threat of some kind to that country, which, if we're being honest, shouldn't even exist, but that was a whole other video. An important thing I want to note here is throughout all this, these comments about our folk devil themselves will trickle down to their supporters, whether they're just prominent or even just random ass members of the public. We'll see some consequences later, but I felt like noting this generalized threat narrative was a good way to make sure that we're aware that's what's happening in the background of this as well. This wasn't the last of official events related wildness, and some of you might say, well, maybe he should have just sang the national anthem even if you think it's not a big deal. And I hear you're wrong, by the way, but it's certainly an opinion you could hold, and I can understand how you would end up holding that opinion. So let's turn to this cenotaph. For those of you who are blessed to be free from the curse that these isles have, you probably don't know that the cenotaph is a war memorial in London, which is apparently where you meet someone when they're challenging you to a fight online. Anyway, I'm going to leave that alone. And typically what happens every Remembrance Day is the various significant political figures of the UK show up, they lay a wreath of poppies, they perform a slight bow, and everyone more or less gets on with their day. Let me pose a question to you. What if the press decided that the angle of the bow wasn't correct? Well, surely that'd be water under the bridge, and the seriousness of the event would mean that we should think about those who died in war rather than produce an etiquette expert to cry about it in a national newspaper. I think you can guess what happened. Let's go to the quote.
Did refuse to bow low enough? Once it was acknowledged that had in fact bowed, the anger turned to whether he had bowed low enough. The etiquette expert, William Hanson, told the Telegraph his issue was the bow was not deep enough. Protocol dictates that while his bow did not necessarily have to be deep, like a theatrical bow and scrape, it should have gone down around 45 degrees from the waist. He barely did anything, But that said, it is his right not to bow, and the people he was there to remember fought for our rights to do or not to do anything. Whilst I do not agree with him, we all have the right to mark the occasion in different ways. It is his first time in this role at the cenotaph, and he is not cut from the cloth of a statesman.
Oh my god, the press was literally getting the protractors out to measure respect. In a way, I can almost respect that level of derangement if it wasn't so serious. This wasn't the last of the cenotaph-related incidents. The very next year, our folk devil was caught dancing a jig on their way there. What a horrible bastard they are! Except they weren't doing that because that's obviously insane. So insane that the original articles have been scrubbed from the internet, and all we're left with, well, without resorting to the Wayback Machine, is a Press Gazette article noting the deletion. Now, you might be raising an eyebrow at me. This all seems kind of harmless, sensational, sure, but is it really that bad? Everything I've shown you up to now was within the first 12 months of our folk devil's rise to prominence. So what's the next step up from there? Well, it's this, and I don't know how I'm going to censor this to make it look remotely appropriate without giving the game away, but there it is. So you might say to me, well, okay, SK, that's clearly a metaphor. They don't mean it. Well, let's look at some context. This was released a few days after the UK's vote to leave the EU. Something that people forget about that campaign was that a sitting member of Parliament was murdered by a far-right extremist just 10 days before this headline went up. Does that seem like an appropriate tone given the context? And I know this is a very lib thing to do, to focus on tone and not content. The content was also dogshit, by the way. This generally cavalier attitude towards what would usually be considered quite aggressive speech extended to members of Parliament, with notorious rent-a-gob Jess Phillips chiming,
If that means making better, I'll roll my sleeves up. If that's not going to happen, and I've said this to him and to his staff to their faces, the day that you are hurting us more than you are helping us, I won't knife you in the back, I'll knife you in the front.
And as we'll see later, I think this attitude, aided by the press, by elected officials and by other senior public figures, had consequences. It certainly seems to me like a certain kind of panic, and indeed instigation of that panic, had begun to take hold by this point, at least among the press and their allies. When you consider the general insanity of the press coverage around our folk devil, and as we'll see, their supporters, I don't think you can deny that. Take this incident about an act of politically motivated vandalism.
The constituency office of the MP has been vandalised following the launch of her campaign to unseat as leader of the party. Merseyside police said they attended constituency office in the Liscard area of Wallasey, Merseyside on Tuesday and were investigating a report of criminal damage. A spokesman for said a brick had been thrown through the window of the office either overnight or on Tuesday morning.
Sounds pretty horrible until you consider that we have no way of knowing that the act of vandalism was even performed by a supporter of the folk devil. Especially important given this event was happening in the aftermath of the EU membership referendum, and that this MP was a supporter of Remain, and the fact that, well, the incident didn't necessarily happen as it was reported in the press, or, to be generous, there was a lot of context missing. For example, the office was in a hotspot for non-political vandalism, and the police confirmed that there was no evidence that a brick had done the damage, which is curious to me because wouldn't you at least find a brick if there had been a bricking? I digress, because this isn't about specific rebuttals after all, but this pivot to potential violent acts by supporters, even where the evidence is circumstantial at best, was one of the first in a long line of portrayals of supporters of the folk devil as thugs. In fact, this culminated in a friend's podcast saying these folk devil supporters going into marginal seats with their Slipknot shirts, which I will admit felt a little targeted, given what I was doing at the time and what shirt I was wearing non-stop. I need to speed up this section, because I can't talk about literally everything that happened, but here's another one from the early days, which is good because it gives me a chance to talk about mistakes. Now, mistakes happen, and we tend to pay more attention when they happen around figures of note or controversy, even if that controversy is manufactured. But there was an interesting pattern that emerged, not just early on, but throughout the period of moral panic. Every single significant mistake in coverage either favoured opponents of the folk devil or actively damaged the folk devil themselves. Like I said, sometimes mistakes happen, but if mistakes keep happening to the same effect as opposed to just random ones, then you can't blame people for thinking something structural is going on. I'm not going to get into the role that bias had to play into it, but I think habit had a significant amount to do with mistakes like this.
Says PM should come clean over family finances after Panama leak. Should resign over this call?
Which was so egregious that it was deleted. Now, I'm being very generous in saying that it was a mistake, because frankly it's so divorced from any reasonable understanding of the situation that I can't imagine it was deliberate. Like, I literally cannot imagine that. But given what we know so far, maybe the jury is out, actually. There are other examples of mistakes falling in a particular direction, but a lot of them would break the gimmick of the video. But suffice to say that in an atmosphere where this was going on,
3/4 of newspaper stories about in the first months of his leadership either distorted or failed to represent his actual views on subjects, a study has found. Academics at the London School of Economics analysed the content of 8 national newspapers between the 1st of September and the 1st of November 2015, when was first elected. The media researchers found that in 52% of articles about the leader, his own views were not included, while in a further 22% they were present but taken out of context or otherwise distorted.
It's not exactly hard to see why some people got into that habit a little bit. A bit like this Simpsons clip.
Bart, no! What? Sorry, force of habit. Lisa, no!
I really like that clip, so I'm glad I got to include it. But there's something that I've not spoken about, and it goes back to those graphs I showed you earlier. There's a sudden rise in these lines, and that's part of what's unusual. Usually when something or someone is subjected to these dynamics, they don't recover, at least not on the time scale that we're talking about here. But our folk devil is a special case. One reason is they're genuinely not like the monster they're portrayed as is the case for every folk devil within a moral panic, by the way. And in Britain there are certain rules around reporting in certain periods, and that vertical rise relates to one of those periods. So we see, when the press were forced to make the moral panic ebb, so too did our folk devil cease to be the folk devil in the minds of people. You'll notice that the previous levels of antipathy returned reasonably quickly on a personal level for our folk devil. And while I'd love to go through everything that happened after this scare, where the folk devil looked like they were going to actually sustain popularity, I just want to go over 2 specific incidents. One that melted my brain, and the other that showed just how bad it got. Just before this period where the press had to report what I would call accurately on things, we got to see this insane piece of work.
Champions universal benefits with free school meals policy. Is this the nasty face of
Which, I don't even know what to say to that. But there it is. So when you're so obviously the victim of a moral panic that you can't even say kids deserve free food at school without it being nasty. Then there was this episode involving... I'm going to regret this, but let's just go to it.
On Tuesday, he inadvertently added to his woes by mispronouncing Jeffrey Epstein's name in an election debate with Prime Minister Boris Johnson. In response to a question by the debate's moderator about a recent interview in which Prince Andrew, the second son of Queen Elizabeth II, defended his friendship with Epstein, brought up the victims of Epstein's sexual misconduct. Before we discuss Prince Andrew, I think we should discuss the victims that are there because of what Epstein was doing, said.
This is insane for a number of reasons. Firstly, because why are we trying to defend the honor of a dead paedophile? Secondly, that's how the name is pronounced in German, which, if you knew nothing about how people say the name, is how you try to pronounce it. If you want an idea of how out of hand the coverage got towards the end, our folk devil was considered more of a villain in the year 2019 than Jeffrey Epstein himself. I'm not joking. Here's the proof.
The world of politics has provided us with 6 of the top 10 villains this year, demonstrating the impact of a turbulent domestic and international political scene. President Trump's numerous controversies have meant he takes the title of Villain of the Year for a 4th time running. 2 in 5, 39%, voted him as a villain in 2019, though this is down from 47% last year. Came second with 29%, followed by Jeffrey Epstein, 28%.
You might be sitting there thinking, so what? Well, it turns out you can't make someone into a cartoon villain without people acting upon it. And part of my reasoning behind showing this all to you and explaining it in the way I did is that even if the saintly stuff was overplayed, the fact is that being in a statistical tie with the actual human trafficking nonce Jeffrey Epstein for Villain of the Year would require you to be, as bad as him, and I don't think that's the case. And as we'll see in the next section, driving someone's name into the mud has consequences. So let's see what those were. The consequences. So far, I've mostly described things in a relatively abstract way, without really thinking about the cost of this particular moral panic or the creation of this particular folk devil. I don't want to talk in hypotheticals, so I'm going to keep to the facts of the matter as much as possible. But I do want to offer 2 anecdotes that relate to this. One of them is from the time this was sort of at its peak, and one was about how I felt writing this. And I want to say before we get into it that the things I'm describing here were not just an accidental outcome, but the explicit desire of a lot of the people who pushed the moral panic and that created our folk devil. So bear that in mind when I talk about consequences. These were desirable outcomes for some, and we should reflect privately, because I don't want to get banned from YouTube.com if I say what I want to say about some people, particularly in the press, on what that means about those people. The first of my anecdotes is about what was going on at the time. So you've probably guessed who the folk devil is and what their job was, so let's just come out and say that I put in a lot of hours for this person. And on the official launch of the campaign where I was out canvassing, and I had a person come up to the group I was with and start verbally abusing us, looking like he wanted to have a fight with us. Now, I happen to be a reasonably large person. We were in a group of 8, and the guy just came off as powerfully divorced. If for people who don't know what that means, just think of Elon Musk. So it was mostly funny rather than scary. But the fact that a person felt emboldened to do that was eye-opening, and I didn't really know how to process it at the time, whether it was normal or weird. I just didn't know, but just anecdotally, I don't know a single person who was doing the same thing I was who didn't have an incident like that to talk about, which should tell us something, I think. The second anecdote was about how I felt writing this. Aside from the fact that this involved remembering things, which is a cardinal sin on Normal Island, it did feel like a lot of this stuff had happened in another life. And this exercise has made me remember that this really hasn't ended necessarily. People still bleat about the folk devil. I had a lot of submissions in my Discord, which, by the way, is now open to all. You only need the Patreon to get into the VIP section, so the link is down below for you all if you want to join in the Discord. And the thing is, I didn't really feel comfortable adding some of the submissions, partially because this is not about detailed rebuttal, but about the structure of how a moral panic creates folk devils and what that actually did, and because, I'll be honest with you, I was a little anxious about potential backlash. I get that this is a channel that's very recently got to 1,000 subscribers, but something I'll talk about in a second will make this anxiety maybe a bit more clear to you. But I think the mere fact that trying to address the totality of the facts here was frankly too much for a single video and would have made me feel vulnerable to certain aspects of what we're going to be talking about. Maybe that tells us something. Maybe I'm a sensitive baby, or maybe that I've convinced myself that this is at least somewhat grounded in facts. At least I hope it is. One of the consequences that was faced was a kind of social media vigilante being created with the sole purpose of harassing people who were seen as being aligned to the folk devil. This ranged from pretty typical trolling tactics like sea lining, which is where you constantly act like you're in good faith asking questions but just keep on badgering people. I should stop using animals in this, but you get the idea. Just look up sea lining, there's a very funny comic strip about it. Or camping out in people's mentions on Twitter.com, all the way to actual dossiers being compiled about people and being submitted to political parties, which is just so spectacularly normal. Some of these people were just emboldened right-wing thugs, and by that I do mean basically indistinguishable from street fascists who were using the creation of the folk devil by the moral panic to launder their own politics, and to be honest, to project onto the left. These people are actually organised into groups, and I don't want to give them the oxygen of publicity by being specific, but whenever the central account in this network gets banned, usually for violating the hateful conduct policies since the account can't stop being racist, You see a hashtag with people demanding the account be reinstated. Well, you would if you weren't an expert in social media creation like me and used the trending tab as a way to block accounts who talk about the stuff you don't need to see. Some of the people who have effectively taken on the role of social media vigilante found themselves getting treated seriously by a certain entity. You know it, you love it, the British press. And while the term journalist is perhaps inappropriate to describe some of these people, it is interesting that some journalists who have very short tempers with anyone to the left of Mussolini essentially built those careers by being vicious trolls whose content boiled down to complaining about how our folk devil had shit in their pants. Might this path to relevance, or as close as they'll ever get, have an impact on the quality of not just this group of people's journalistic work, but the people who are filtering up now? Who can say? Well, I can. It will, because that's how incentive structures work. I would argue that the UK political system is one where violence had entered it a long time ago, and that usually starts the countdown to a system basically breaking down. But there was an interesting expression of that which occurred in this period. Our folk devil was themselves the target of a plot by a terrorist who intended to kill him, but upon realising he was unable to do so, he decided to drive a van into a group of worshippers outside a mosque, and he actually explained why he did it in court.
Darren Osborne became obsessed with Muslims after watching a BBC TV drama about a child sex abuse scandal involving British Pakistani men, and just weeks later carried out the attack in Finsbury Park, North London. On June 18th last year, Osborne drove up from the Welsh capital Cardiff to central London in a hired van with the intent of attacking a pro-Palestinian march. He told the jury he had wanted to kill socialist opposition and London's. Thwarted by road closures, he sought out other targets, eventually arriving hours later in Finsbury Park, where he came across a group of Muslims tending to Ali who had collapsed in the street near his home after attending Ramadan prayers.
There was also an incident where someone punched our folk devil in the head, but they were miraculously carrying an egg, and of course the fact that an egg was involved meant that it was a laughing matter. Though, and I am sure of this, a lot of them may have wished that the man was holding something else. I'm sure the reaction to Charles getting egged was the same, and there wasn't mass media fury about it, right? Everyone was really cool with it. It's a laughing matter. Charles getting hit by an egg? Really fucking funny. Of course, as I've tried to point out, while the folk devil is created by a moral panic, the impact trickles down, and one underreported event was that elderly canvassers were assaulted due to the atmosphere produced by the press and their allies.
Has condemned separate unprovoked attacks inflicted on two party activists in their 70s as they were out canvassing over the weekend. The first incident occurred in Herefordshire on Saturday morning, while the second took place early the following evening in South Yorkshire. Police said a man had been arrested on suspicion of grievous bodily harm in relation to the second.
We're really yet to see all of the consequences unfold, and while with this kind of figure there are all kinds of hypotheticals and counterfactuals we could go into, it's not really the point of what we're doing here. So for now, I'm going to leave it there. I'll go into some more organised thoughts, collecting all of this together in the conclusion, which is where we're going now. Put the panel in. Put the panel in. God, will you just put the panel? Concluding thoughts. What was the point of all that? Well, part of it was that I just wanted to say the last thing I'll ever really want to say about our folk devil example, who, let's be honest, if you're British, you probably guessed who I was talking about. But I at least wanted to pretend I was trying to persuade people to make myself feel better, and also justify the thumbnail, which I had a lot of fun making. The other part is that a certain anniversary passed recently, and I felt like since I have and am moving on, I'm moving on from it, I promise, I needed to get this out of my head. Also, you hogs on the Patreon/Discord voted for it. The other point I wanted to make is that our folk devil wasn't a bad guy, or at least wasn't obviously a bad guy. The press cycled through whatever they could get their hands on to try to make something stick and create a moral panic around them. And eventually, given time and the force multiplier that the press have, it worked. And that sucks. Which was the title of the last video I did on this matter. It does suck, and it makes me wonder if it can happen to someone who was largely on the surface an alright person, what chance does anyone really have? My general feeling is that you should treat people who engage in it, not the people taken in who are largely innocent and have been been scared by the mass hysteria, with contempt. But at a certain point, contempt isn't enough. The truth is, sometimes these videos don't have a point, other than to just vaguely gesture at something and say, that's fucked up. And it was fucked up. And I feel like if you know who I was talking about during this and you supported them, you might need to hear that. It wasn't normal. It was a panic. And the things you experienced and saw did happen. And with that, I think I can leave this chapter of my life behind me. For now. I just want to thank everyone who lent a hand with this video, my partner who proofread the script, my good friend Mick Wright, who proofread it and also did some voiceover for this, Dr. Eleanor Yanaga, Jamie from Peace at Home, Alistair from Praxis Cast, Alien Bob, David also from Praxis Cast. All of those people also provided some voiceover work for this, so thank you very much to them. You can find links to all of their cool stuff down below. And I also have to thank the special people, the coolest people in the world, the patrons. So a special shout out to the top tier patrons, Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kersey Scheider, and SMD, who is new. So thank you to SMD for joining the crew. If you would like to join the Patreon, it's £1 a month at the lowest tier, and it gets you access to the VIP section of the Discord. But otherwise, the Discord is completely free. The link is in the description, as I said. And remember, everyone, like, subscribe. It all goes a long way towards helping me. But with all of that said, I think it's time for me to go and start the next chapter of my life and forget about all of this horrible shit. So, take it easy, everyone. Catch you in the next one.